In this lecture, we will be taking a look at labeling theory. We will be framing it in relation to the work of sociologists and their understanding of what is also known as symbolic interactionism. We will be specifically focusing on how the labels that a society assigns to an individual and their pattern of behavior connects to what we understand to be as the concept of self and identity. So let's take a closer look at labeling theory as it relates to criminology. Labeling theory as an application in criminal justice and criminal justice studies has waned quite a bit. If we take a look at some of the ideas that are emerging at the end of the 19th century and in the opening decades of the 20th century, labeling theory ultimately drives much of our public policies relating to curbing things like recidivism in prison populations. Because labeling theory focuses strongly on the idea of how labels stigmatize, it has fallen out of favor from one decade to the next in terms of its application in the formulation of public policy making. However, in recent years, as we move into the 21st century, it has been rediscovered by a variety of local municipalities. Even there are national programs which will focus on labeling theory in a very diverse manner, and we'll take a look at that near the end of this lecture. So in this case, the idea and the power having to do with labels, how they are in a sense embraced or how they are rejected, lie at the center of this theoretical perspective. Sociologists Gresham Sykes and David Matza in the 1950s and later in the 1980s studied what are referred to as techniques of neutralization and how these were being utilized by individuals in a way to deflect or to curb the impact of a society's norms. These studies represent examples of how labels can be denied and the responsibility associated with these labels, the roles that you may play in a society relating to a given label, how that responsibility can also be denied, and how this denial, in a sense, or how these labels are being neutralized, can ultimately result in an intensification of what are referred to or recognized to be as defiant or deviant behaviors. But for the most part, labels as they relate to this theoretical school are considered to be things that are generally embraced by individuals, things that prove to be very, very meaningful to the people who are either assigning the labels or individuals to whom the labels are being assigned. Now, these labels can have a couple different functions in terms of how they are either intensifying a behavior or how they are curbing a related behavior. If, for example, we take studies that have been done with regard to gang activity, motorcycle gangs, for example, in the work of Mark Watson in the 1980s and just a few decades ago as well, or a decade ago rather, as well. What he was finding in his research is that um, motorcycle gangs in his study ultimately embraced the labels that they were given by the larger society. And they also seem to embrace or even wear as a badge of honor the kind of deviance that we have on a kind of a popular cultural level have assigned to motorcycle gangs. Watson found that, in fact, the labels that were being applied or the stigma that was being assigned to members of a motorcycle gang actually acted to intensify the kinds of behaviors that labeling by its social application attempts to curb or prevent. Now, when we apply labeling or labels in a research environment, we realize that there is a kind of cause and effect design to how sociologists and criminologists apply labeling theory. Your authors identify two particular kinds of variables. These variables are going to be very, very familiar to you if you have been exposed to, in this case, statistics and how generally research is initially designed. There are dependent variables. Dependent variables would represent the effect that using a label may have in relation to a behavior or behavioral field. And then you have independent variables. These would be the causes. So, in a sense, these would be the actual um, practices that are associated with the labeling process itself. And a labeling theorist rather, will look at how these two variables play upon one another. The question we have to ask ourselves is really what is coming first in this process? Is it the label and the application of that label that will result in an intensification of a behavior or in the reduction of a behavior? Or is it the behavior that comes first and inspires the almost immediate application of a particular kind of stereotype, stigma, or in this case, label? Now, when you take a look at the ideas of theorists working in this field, applying labeling theory, shame theory, or some variation of these theoretical schools of thought to public policy making, to law enforcement, or to corrections, what you'll find is that you'll have almost a 50-50 split between this idea of cause and effect and the impact that a label or stigma can have on the behaviors of people, not only in the moment, but then also how these will impact future behaviors or lack thereof. However, what we can all really agree upon is the role that power plays in the acceptance or the rejection of a particular label, stereotype, or stigma. The power of a label ultimately within a social setting lies at the heart of how an individual is interacting with power in that society. If you recognize yourself as experiencing a lack of power, then a label has a very significant role in your behaviors and how you model your actions. It also has a very strong connection to how you develop self and how you develop your sense of identity in relation to a social setting. What we find with regard to how criminal justice is currently being revised and reformed is that individuals who have a weakened access to power, if we look at it through a, let's say, a class system, people that are considered to be of a lower class do not represent or feel that they are not well represented within the current criminal justice system, and that individuals of a middle or upper class appear to have, in this case, a greater say in how labels are established and how they are ultimately assigned to groups and individuals within a society. This leads us to the concept that based upon how you are categorized and classified within a social structure, within a society, this will represent in some way, shape, or form aspects or variables of what could or could not be connected to your relationship with the criminal justice system. Whether or not, for example, you will be arrested or have been arrested in recent history. If you are violating a law, whether or not you have a greater or lesser chance to be convicted or imprisoned for that particular behavior or what is associated with it. So the idea here, and this is what we're seeing a lot in the reforms that are currently being proposed in both political and um, criminal settings, we realize that an individual's race, an individual's age, an individual's social or economic status or class status, or even an individual's gender may in fact play a very significant role in the labels that are assigned to that individual, and then ultimately how that individual is experiencing the criminal justice field. So we are left with, again, another general question as it relates to criminal activities. Is the crime relatable in this case to the label and its impact, or how a particular label is framed within the history of a society or within a modern expression of a society, or is it the individual who is participating in that criminal act? Right? So crimes in themselves, under this theoretical school of thought, may not be relatable solely to the criminal. They may be, in fact, connected more with a group or institution and how that group or institution labels either an action or an actor or a person who is a participant in that process. So, again, at the heart of this theoretical perspective, and at its heart with regards to how it is being applied in public policy, the theorists are saying that we need to reassess our labels, and we have to have a certain level of caution when we are applying labels to individuals in a society. And in a sense, we have to greatly, or give, in a sense, a great deal of attention to motivation, right? So, how does an individual, their place within a society, how they frame themselves, their self concept, their sense of identity, and of course, all of that in relation to the people around them, how does that impact their patterns of behavior, and how does that also impact their relationship with the criminal justice system? So, if we tie this idea back to the larger discipline that this course and this subject matter is connected to, which is in this case sociology, labeling theory is also or is synonymous with, rather, this notion of symbolic interactionism. So, symbolic interactionism in sociological circles really focuses on how we as individuals living within a society establish a sense of self, how we build, and how the environment and the people around us help us to build a sense of identity. And then it connects those two concepts to both psychological and additional social constructs that relate to how we process information, how we communicate, and ultimately the values and attitudes, the sentiments that we have as a member, or as members rather, of a society. So as we look at this, we realize that it really comes down to language. The terms that we use in our framing of the world around us, and the meanings that we assign to those terms. So, again, the power of the label, and to a lesser extent, the power that that label has in the mind of the individual that is either assigning it or to whom that label is being, in a sense, assigned. So, again, this theoretical perspective is really relying upon this notion of how we weigh the consequences of our actions and how those consequences relate to, in this case, the the words and the meanings that are assigned to an action or an individual who is participating in that action. And this power really doesn't stay in that moment of assignment and of communication. It's something that will, by its nature, follow an individual or follow a group of people who have been assigned a particular stigma. If, for example, we have a group of individuals who are recognized as being criminals, or they are assigned by the society in symbolic ways to criminal activities or a tendency toward a criminal act, then prejudices can easily start to form around the physical and behavioral characteristics of people who are fitting into that group in some way, shape, or form. And then there's this really interesting interaction that starts to occur. People who are within that group can choose to reject those labels and push back against those labels. So they may exaggerate behaviors that are contrary to the labels that are being assigned, or they may, as we see in the work of Dr. Watson and his study of motorcycle gangs, as I previously mentioned, how it may actually intensify their participation in actions or behaviors that are in a sense, underneath the umbrella of that particular label or stereotype. So it can have both positive and seemingly negative effects. So it can either intensify a behavior or it can help to curb that behavior. And this is what really gives labeling theory with regard to how it is used in reform and in public policy making or in the development of programs and their evaluation, how it makes it a very much of a double-edged sword and something that has to be very carefully understood, both through the lens of the sociologist, but also through the lens of the behavioralist, of the psychologist. So then, at its heart, it becomes what, in this case, Akers and Sellers identify as a kind of looking glass self. The idea that the labels that are being assigned to groups and individuals by the society and how those individuals and groups are interacting with those labels, those stereotypes, those terms, and their meanings will, in a sense, help to shape their self and help to shape, in a sense. So this becomes a very strong social force and even a socializing force as an individual is shaping their identity, especially as an adolescent. So another aspect of what we're looking at here, and something that is also coming across in some of the related readings, is that labeling theory appears to have its best application in juvenile delinquency and in the legal system as it relates to how we deal with juvenile or adolescent deviance or behaviors, again, that in relation to the social norms are seen as improper or things that are seen or even framed as criminal in nature. The question that many labeling theorists will make as it relates to this very formative piece of the puzzle is whether or not we should even consider juvenile delinquency as it relates to a specific criminal act as criminal, or should we completely reframe that? Something that is seen quite often in the news and, of course, in our legal system is how an adolescent or how a child, a subadult, should be treated by the criminal justice system. Should that child be tried as an adult, or should they be addressed in some other way? Should they be incarcerated as a result of the findings of their acts, as it relates, of course, to the criminal court system, or should they be involved in a community program or a mental health program that is designed to prevent recidivism and to curb whatever is motivating that particular kind of deviant behavior or deviant action? So here's another layer that we have to consider when we're looking at the effectiveness of labeling theory and how it is being applied in criminal justice circles. We know that by its nature, or by their nature rather, labels and their meanings will connect with concepts of the self or the self concept. They will also motivate individuals They will provide individuals with reactions to people and, of course, the world around them. And we also know that by their nature, as it relates to power, labels will close and open doors of opportunities, or opportunity rather, for individuals within a society. So, again, beyond the term deviant and how it is used in everyday language and how we apply it to judgments and, of course, the criminal acts which lead up to them, we also realize that labels and how they are being applied beyond just um, behaviors that do not conform to social norms, that these labels can act in very exclusive ways and can limit the access and opportunities that people have to succeed within a larger social and societal framework. So both the label associated with the act and then the label that we are assigning to the actor are, in a sense, responses to threats. And in this case, they are responses to threats uh, relating to the social order. This connects very, very strongly with what we had already looked at regarding the theorist Max Weber and his ideas of statehood. That the state, by its nature, is required to maintain social order and to exact social control. And how it does this is multifaceted. And that people, by their nature, are motivated in one way or another by this constant threat of force that the state, by its nature, represents. And so, Weber, as we apply his ideas to this notion of labeling, is demonstrating to us that the labels that are assigned to people and to actions are definitely part of this process. If we are, for example, demonizing, to use a kind of a popular cultural colloquialism, demonizing an act or demonizing a particular kind of individual or group, that label will affect not only that moment in time, but it will have an impact on the experiences of individuals and groups for years, decades, centuries to come. And we see this with many of the labels that are seen as unjust or unfair or prejudice in some way when they are being applied in and throughout a society. So, when deviance, in a sense, is met with community wide reactions, sociologists recognize the establishment of both positive and negative sanctions. And of course, labeling is a big part of this process, as is labeling and the role of law and the power of those in charge of a social setting, or in this case, in the West, the state. So, as you can see, this is not a clear and well defined process. Labels, both through a linguistic lens and through a sociological lens, and even through a psychological lens, have a very multifaceted impact both on the individual and on the society. So, mechanisms then that are assigned to how we maintain order or social control in a society are going to ultimately be tied into the kinds of words and meanings that we assign to either the behaviors that are stimulating these mechanisms to begin to work, in this case, to curb a behavior, or they may, in a sense, have a negative effect or a negative feedback where we start to see these labels ultimately causing behaviors that are considered to be deviant and again stimulating these social control mechanisms to begin to function and to assert control over a particular setting. And that's what these ideas of primary and secondary deviance as they relate to labels and labeling theories, or labeling theory rather, what these really relate to. So primary deviance in this case is the result of behavior that leads to a label being assigned to an actor or an action. Whereas a secondary kind of deviance is really more of a reaction against a particular kind of label, or it can be, in this case, or it can result rather in an intensification of a particular kind of activity. So, the idea that, okay, you're gonna recognize me to be this kind of individual, well, then I will not only meet that label, but uh, I will shine at that particular, or I will succeed at the particular behaviors that are connected to that label. So again, just to kind of reframe these and reinforce them a little bit for you, primary deviance, as it relates to labels and labeling, is going to, in a sense, be the result of or a reaction to a deviant behavior, whereas a secondary deviance, again, resulting from a labeling process, or, well, it would be always resulting from a labeling process in this case, is going to be a reaction to the application of that label. And so this helps us, this additional distinction helps us to be able to understand a little bit of that previous concept of what comes first, right? The criminal act or the label that we assign to it. So beyond this, then, we also see that laws in themselves and how people, groups, members of a society, subsets of a society, how they look to those laws may also connect with behavioral choices. So if a law is seen as too restrictive or unjust, um, people may react by participating in the behavior that is in defiance to whatever that law is identifying or framing. Let's take a look at how this labeling theory acts in the world around us, specifically in the programs that are designed to curb particular kinds of behaviors, or to reduce patterns of recidivism as they relate to deviant acts. And you will want to create a section within your note-taking that will be assigned to this particular study, so that you can go back and look at some of the pieces of the study and even the program that it is evaluating, um, to be able to understand this notion of juvenile diversion or diversion programs as they relate to public policies geared or connected with, in a sense, the criminal justice system. So, Kathleen Jordan is a professor of social work at the University of Texas in Arlington. She and her colleagues at the University of Texas collaborated with the court system to evaluate the Youth Offender Diversion Project, abbreviated YODA. This project was a direct response to, in this case, trends, very negative trends, in youth arrests for violent crimes in and around the Arlington area, in this case throughout Tarrant County in Texas. The violent acts in this case were generally um, focused on family members. So they were specifically looking at, in this case, youth arrests as they relate to violence toward non-intimate partner family members, mothers, sisters, things like this. And again, they wanted to see how this juvenile diversion model, how this program attempting to kind of lift off some of the negative labels, and this program designed in a sense to impart more positive labels to juvenile offenders, how this was either reducing or flatlining the recidivism rates um, and the success rates as they related to the program for, in this case, research subjects. The subjects themselves numbered approximately 120 individuals. These were, again, youth offenders who were charged with some sort of domestic violence toward a non-intimate partner family member. And these were also juveniles who were awaiting arraignment or were waiting for their hearing to be scheduled or to occur. While they awaited arraignment, these individuals were incorporated into the YOTA program. And again, the aim of the program was, by its nature, to provide the young people with the tools and to retool the labels assigned to acts and, of course, the young people themselves, all in the hope of preventing future non-intimate partner family violence or curbing, or to curb rather, any sort of violence that would have been applied toward a blood relative of an individual. And so, how they approached this ultimately was multifaceted. So, they applied, in this case, particular kinds of therapeutic models or brief bouts of therapy for those who were waiting arraignment. They were also taking a look at some of the local community programs and educating the young members and, of course, their family members as to some of the community programs that helped in the diversion process. And then they actively engaged the labels themselves, in this case, attempting to deliver messages, voice messages, positive messages, labels that, in a sense, were going to uh, provide these offenders with a new perspective regarding uh, their relationships, especially those relationships within their home. So ultimately, this YOTA program was attempting to divert youth away from the criminal justice system. And the successful completion of the program was something that ultimately was taken into consideration when the arraignment was scheduled to occur. So, successful completion of the program was another important variable that was being studied by Dr. Jordan and her colleagues. There were a variety of assessment tools that the researchers applied, including, in this case, an initial competency interview. And these tools were very, very helpful in standardizing measures with regard to not only an individual's success within the program and, of course, the successful completion of the program, but it incorporated some of the environmental and demographic data that appears to be a contributor to not only the labels that were being assigned to young offenders, but also the surrounding agents that were either contributing or actively preventing a particular kind of deviant behavior from occurring in the first place. So ultimately, they were looking at not only the program itself and evaluating its outcomes, but then they were also really looking at the impact that programs that are designed around juvenile diversion and this notion of breaking down stigmas and almost secondary deviance as it relates to those stigmas, how this program was ultimately engaging some of those pieces. So the outcome data that Dr. Jordan and her colleagues were looking at ultimately were based on a kind of a pre-test and post-test format. They were focusing on 49 of the 120 clients who were part of this pre-arraignment program. And they ultimately were looking at a pretty cosmopolitan population. In terms of the demographics, about 43% of the individuals were Caucasian, about 20% were Hispanic and 23% were African American. 12% of those that were part of this study were considered or were self-identifying as biracial, and 2% would self-identify or did self-identify as Asian. Male participants were comprising the majority of the sample, a little over 50%. And clients' ages in this case ranged from 17 years to 25 years, with a mean age of 19. So it was a pretty good slice of at least life in that county. And ultimately, it was a good resource for being able to understand how people with pretty diverse backgrounds were able to interact with a program, again, designed to reduce recidivism. So there were three scales or assessment tools that were being used. The first tool, and this connects with the first table that I have on this slide, was the MAAS, or the Mindful Attention Awareness Scale for adolescents. This tool was looking specifically at a wide range of kind of problem areas as they related to family environments and social environments. And in this case, it had two very important kind of score ranges. 30 and above indicated a clinical problem, whereas 70 and above indicated a catastrophic issue. So it was really giving the researchers an understanding of the baseline concerns that could be assigned to each of the study participants. So as you can see here, again, a couple things to really focus in on is the pre-test, post-test kind of number or score for things like depression or problems with a particular family member or problems in school. And you can kind of see if there is an increase or a decrease in this case. That's kind of the general um, or the specific means of being able to understand, how the program is helping to curb that particular environmental or relationship related issue. And then the other important number to keep track of, but all of them are conforming to a statistically significant score, is that p-value for the paired t-test. So all the way on the right hand side there, again, you're dealing with p-values that demonstrate significance. So all of these are significant in terms of what you're seeing with regard to the trend and the number of study participants that, of course, were able to be assessed for this tool. The second table then incorporates two additional short-term measures. There is the SBI, which is generally a screen or a screening process for behavioral intervention. The SBI is again a 14-item questionnaire, and it has a 5-point Likert rating scale. High scores in this case, as Dr. Larson points out, indicate better solution builders, and so you can compare that pre-test, post-test kind of score. So is it, in a sense, going up? Kind of the opposite of what we saw with the MAAS. And again, the p-score becomes very, very important here for statistical significance in the trend that you're seeing in these reported numbers. Then the last short-term assessment is the CYRM. This is the Child and Youth Resilience Measure. Sometimes it is paired with an adult device when we're dealing with multiple individuals, but generally they were just using the CYRM in this. This is a 28 question self-reporting instrument that is being used in a sense to understand an individual's resistance, or rather resilience, to a particular kind of tendency or particular kind of issue regarding the the act itself that is deviant and whether or not one is going to be participating in that. A higher score in this case would also identify an individual who is more resilient and more persistent in terms of best practices in their home, in their community, things like that. So for both the SBI and the CYRM, we would want to see if the program is being effective and is really kind of transforming the labels and the meanings, and of course the particular kinds of self and identity based control issues. If the program is impacting the individual in a positive way, we would want to see both of those scores, the mean scores for the group, increase. And of course, the p value to be extremely low. And so we have all of that occurring. So it seemed to be a really good evaluation for this YODA program and the impact that it was having on at least the individuals that were sampled for the study. And then the last table that I have here is summarizing their findings with regard to another assessment test, the NAS-PI, or this Novico Anger Scale and Provocation Inventory. Generally, this was looking at, it was a self-reporting questionnaire that was looking at, in this case, cognitive kinds of responses to negative thoughts and positive and negative situations. It also takes a look at personal memories and meanings. And then there is an arousal component which focuses on the physical experience of an individual when they are in the midst of an anger response, and it assesses, in this case, in a pre-test, post-test format, their ability to, in this case, deal with anger and deal with the environmental and behavioral provocations for a potentially violent outcome or violent act. So as we look at this a little more closely, in the cognitive line, we would want to see a decrease between that pre-test, post-test assessment. This again is reducing the impact that particular kinds of memories and experiences were having on an individual's anger response. It was also a particular variable or assessment piece that gave the researchers an idea as to how people framed those experiences and those memories. Again, how they themselves were self-labeling. Again, we would want to see a reduction in this, which we saw at a statistically significant level. For arousal, again, an anger response, we would want to see as the program played out in terms of a pre-test, post-test kind of assessment. We would want to see a decrease in anger being the primary choice by the individual in question. Then on the behavioral line, again, asking about behaviors that are problematic or indicative of violence, or in this case, a violent reaction. The reduction in this would also be something that would be important. And then the other line to look at here would be, or would relate to anger regulation as it related to everything else that was part of this assessment tool. Anger regulation was asking about the adaptive aspects of the experience of the anger in terms of the ability to evaluate and direct angry responses in a more constructive manner. So in this case, with the anger regulation, we would want to see an increase in that particular scalar number because we would want an individual to be able to, as a result of going through this program, we would want an individual to be more constructive in how they were evaluating a situation and even how they were experiencing a particular emotion or category of emotions that may be assigned to anger. So in this case, when you take a look at what Dr. Jordan and her colleagues were finding with regard to this Youthful Offender Diversion Project. The successful completion of the program was having a positive impact on how young people who were part of the criminal justice program prior to arraignment were, in a sense, able to deal with the anger that had led to their involvement in the criminal system. It was also something that was helping to kind of reteach the juvenile offender regarding how they labeled themselves and how they labeled these experiences, and then how they ultimately dealt with those labels in the moment. And so the kind of moral of the story here, and this is something that relates to this concept of diversion, which is the kind of public policy outcome of labeling theory, and to a lesser extent shaming theory. This is something that really appears to be a positive impact, or is having a positive impact on these trends within the criminal justice system, preventing a particular behavior that may lead to incarceration, or reteaching an individual with regard to not only their access to power and how they feel about that, but how they deal with these emotions that are a big part of their growth and development, and how they help to, in a sense, um, connect the young people with a better system of self control.